Welcome to the Bhagavata podcast. I'm Broo, a senior lecturer at Akademi University in Finland and a senior research fellow at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. I'll be a host for this podcast inspired by the work of the Gaudiya Studies research project at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. This podcast is a series of discussions on chapters of the Bhagavata Purana, a classic text of Vaishnava philosophy, sacred law, and profound ritual traditions. What makes this podcast unique? Every guest here is not only a trained scholar of Indology and related disciplines, but also a dedicated Vaishnava practitioner. This blend of rigorous academic scholarship and lived devotion allows us to explore the Bhagavata Purana through a rare and insightful lens. Here, theology is not just theory, it is scholarship in dialogue with faith. And to honor that, my guests and I will embrace Vaishnava tradition fully, including wearing the sacred marks of the tradition and using our Vaishnava names. Thank you for joining us for the Bhagavata podcast. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanao Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu Mavidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Today I'm particularly excited to be joined by Radhika Raman Das, or Dr. Ravi M. Gupta, Professor of Religious Studies at Utah State University. I've known you for some time, and you're the kind of person that whenever I meet you, I feel that I'm enlightened and inspired as well. So we'll see what happens during today's discussion.
That's very kind of you, Bhrigupada Prabhu, and I'm very much looking forward to our first podcast session together and to spending time with you today.
Today we're covering the third chapter of the Srimad Bhagavatam, and we're continuing on with Sutta replying to Shaunaka and the Rishi's questions. If I remember correctly, then in this chapter we get the answers to the fifth and sixth questions. Is my memory correct, or am I messing things up?
Yes, I have not been able to keep track of the questions and their correspondence to the different chapters. I remember the question that they're answering in this chapter is the question about Krishna's Avataras, his descents to this world. And so that's the focus of the chapter. The numbering I don't quite remember now.
I'm using as my cheat book a delightful little book, Sri Sri Bhagavata Samlapa by Swami Bhakti Pradeep Tirtha. He was a disciple of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And this is a book where he collects kind of discussions of the Bhagavatam, and he shows how they kind of work. So he has here a chapter on exactly this question, and I'll cheat by checking from here. Yes, the fifth chapter, that was, what are the divine descents and deeds of the Supreme Lord Vasudeva Krishna? So that's what Sutta Goswami will begin answering now in this chapter. This is a philosophically quite dense chapter, wouldn't you say? It's not the easiest chapter to read.
It's very significant for the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, for followers of Sri Chaitanya. This chapter is, it's difficult to overstate its importance because of its foundational verse, Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam, which shows up. I think that verse is significant both for its meaning and for its location in the chapter, because it's showing up at the end of a long list of Avataras, and then identifying Krishna as Bhagavan Swayam, as the Supreme Lord himself. So for that reason, this chapter has been studied quite thoroughly, I believe.
And we have here a long list of avatars of the Lord. Many of them being kind of famous avatars, Matsya, Kurma, and so on. But this chapter doesn't follow this 10 avatar system at all, does it?
No. No, I'm not sure historically when exactly the idea of the 10 main avatars of Vishnu arises, but it's definitely there by the time of Jayadev Goswami, which is after the Bhagavata, of course. And so the Bhagavata's lists, we have two chapters, right? We have in the first canto, we have the list of incarnations, and then we have yet another list coming up from Shukadev Goswami, or Lord Brahma speaks the list of avatars as well a little later. And both of those lists are not 10. I forget the number, but they're in the 20s somewhere. The list of 10 is I think, a later summarization. Here, the Bhagavata's point, I think, is well stated 2 verses before the famous verse, where it says that the Avataras of the Lord, the incarnations, the divine descents of the Lord are as many as there are rivulets going into the sea, or waves in the ocean. So there's an endless number, in other words, of the Lord's divine descents.
I noticed that you generally use the word avatara, but you also use the word incarnation. And Prabhupada does that, of course. Some scholars, particularly traditional scholars, they're not very fond of that term. I suppose because you really get the feel then that the Lord becomes flesh. And at least in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, that's not really the understanding of an avatar, is it? What would you say, what's the difference between these two terms?
Yeah, so in one of the purports in this chapter, I forget the verse number, but in one of the purports in this chapter, Prabhupada defines avatara in terms of its etymological meaning. He says that it comes from the verbal root thur, which means to cross, right? Tarati, and ava means down. So Avatara is one who crosses down into this world. And he says for that reason, Krishna can also be called an Avatara because he descends and he's included in the list. But really, he is the source of the Avatara. So that's the context. I think it is in the Ete Cham Sakala Pumsa verse, that famous one, that he says this. But that's the kind of the literal definition of the word Avatar, is the one who descends, the one who crosses down into this world, which I think is a very accurate and beautiful representation of what the avatar actually does. Now the challenge becomes when you need to express this in the English language. Since language and theology are closely tied together, we find this actually happening in the history of every religious tradition that has migrated outside its area of origin and outside of its language of origin. We find this same issue happening of how do we translate, how do we transpose a technical term into a new language. I know when Buddhism made its way to China, we find the same thing. Initially, Buddhist texts are translated into terms that are born from Taoism and Confucianism, and it creates for comprehensible but somewhat inaccurate translations. Other meanings are imported into Buddhist texts, and then they are retranslated after a couple hundred years of Buddhism's presence in China. They're retranslated, I believe, by a monk named Kumarajiva, in order to by that point, they had recognized these variations and these assumptions that were being imported unknowingly into the tradition. So this is the case. I think every direction you think of it. If you read the Bible in I live in Utah and I have a Book of Mormon on my bookshelf that is written in Sanskrit. and it's translated into Sanskrit. And its title, I haven't read it in Sanskrit, but the title is Marman Dharma Shastra, right? And just the word Dharma Shastra itself conveys all kinds of meanings. For me, who knows what Dharma Shastras are in the Sanskritic tradition, in the Hindu tradition, to think of a Mormon Dharma Shastra is perhaps not everything that they intended in translating it, but it was the best word they had, right? So all of that to say that when we're looking for a term for Avatara, we can use the somewhat clunky term descent, but descents really, it's a very thin translation of Avatara. It doesn't convey the sense of form and body that sound can descend, but the tangibility of the avatar is not conveyed with the word descent. Incarnation, I think, conveys the sense of tangibility very well, but perhaps too well, as you're stating, because I think many readers of the Bhagavata may not recognize the etymological origins of that term, particularly if they're not trained in Christian theology. But the challenge with that word incarnation is exactly what you said. That term refers primarily to the embodiment of God in human flesh as Jesus in Christian theology. And the Vaishnava tradition is quite clear that the Lord does not take a body made of matter that is subject to decay and to death in the way that Jesus is said to have died on the cross, right? So that challenge is a very real one with the word incarnation. So as soon as my audiences, my students, are able to understand the word avatara, I just switch to the Sanskrit.
I'm wondering about this concept of avatara. I mean, it's something that students can relate through in various ways. Like there are avatars on social media, and there's the avatar movies and so on. But I'm wondering about this difference between the avatara and the incarnation that you just explained. One of the things that's attractive about the Christian idea of the incarnation is that God really becomes a human being and thus can relate to human suffering and so on. And this seems to perhaps be something of a problem with the Indic avatar idea, that there's even some theologians are going to say that Bhagavan cannot really understand suffering because he's never experienced that himself. I think Vishwanath Chakravarti is making that point in I think in Raghavartma Chandrika. How would you answer a statement like that?
This is a great question. It's one I've thought about a lot. But before I respond to that question, I just want to say your reference to the word avatar in popular culture. I still remember I still remember the year when the major motion picture Avatar first came out and how it changed my teaching. I forget, I think it was 2009 or something like that. And I had been teaching for a few years by then and explaining very painstakingly to students what Avatar was and introducing the term. And then Avatar became popular in social media. It became popular in video games, and it became a major motion picture. And everything changed. Then I was explaining the idea of Avatar in comparison to their preconceived notions about what Avatar were. And in some ways it was helpful because there was already natural interest in the topic. It was relevant. I didn't need to explain why studying the concept of Avatar was important. They wanted to know. And it was also challenging because, of course, they brought their own notion of what Avatar was based on their own experience with it. So it made for very rich conversations in the classroom. And
yeah, and in those movies, for example, there the avatars really are incarnations.
Exactly.
So, so they kind of lead astray in that way.
Yes, and so that term incarnation is not confusing to my students at all because, as you're saying, Avatar is very much an incarnation in popular culture. So, anyway, it's fascinating to see how these concepts become translated. And I was earlier speaking about the formal process of translation with the spread of religions, but I think with Avatar we have the formal translation decisions. Do we call it descent? Do we call it incarnation? Do we keep it untranslated? But then we also have popular culture translations, which adds another layer of meaning to whoever's using that term. So, but your original question, what was that again? I think I strayed.
Can the Lord understand human suffering,
Ah,
not
yes.
really ever having been a human?
Yeah. This is such a crucial question, I think, I mean, this touches on the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. Uh, but it goes beyond that. It has so much to do with divine accessibility and relatability to human beings. It's one of the things I think that Christianity does very well in terms of bringing God very much to a human, making God very accessible to human beings. I think the Vaishnava tradition has been more hesitant at there's to back up for just a moment. There's always these two competing challenges in any theistic tradition. One is God's transcendence, and the other is God's immanence, or as Ramanujacharya says, God's paratva, his supremacy, and his solabhya, or his easy accessibility. And you need both. Any theistic tradition needs both, right? That's the first thing to remember, because if God is not transcendent, then what is the point of worshiping him? If he is exactly like you or me or the world around us, then we don't really need a concept of God. We have the world. And there is nothing advantageous to be gained from his worship. On the other hand, if God is utterly transcendent, then how can we possibly benefit from him if he is not accessible to human beings, right? In what way can he help us? And every theistic tradition really kind of hits that balance of transcendence and immanence in a different way, to a different degree. There are certainly traditions that focus more on the transcendent God, a deistic God who is very much beyond the human realm, right? And others who focus very much on his immanence. I think the first thing that ought to be said about this chapter is that the theology of Avatar, which is beautifully developed in this chapter, and then in his purports, Prabhupada offers really the full theology of avatars as we find in the works of the Goswamis, like Lagu Bhagavatamrita and other places. We see that full, the different types of avatars, Leela avatars and Guna avatars and Shaktyavesha avatars. You find all of those different types of descents described. I think that theology of avatars, if we're to take a step back and ask ourselves, why all the detail? Because, I mean, that's a question that comes up for me reading Bhagavatam. Is like, there's sometimes a lot of detail. Why all the detail? So it's sometimes helpful to take a step back and say, okay, why are we doing this? And for me, I think the main reason we find a robust theology of avatars is to make this point precisely, that God being transcendent, and yet he is accessible to human beings, right? And the theology of avatars is basically a theology of accessibility. It's describing to us how God makes himself available to human beings. Okay, so with that in mind then, to your question about divine suffering, and how does God truly understand where we are at? The Vaishnava tradition is more hesitant than the Christian tradition to place God in the direct line of experience for suffering itself, because the Vaishnava tradition or the Vedantic traditions in general, I think, feel that that would compromise too much God's transcendence. However, they get over that challenge, I think, through two things. One is by emphasizing significantly God's relationality. And we see this developed beautifully in the Bhagavata as a whole, but also particularly in the Gaudiya Vaishnava Acharya's commentaries, right? Where if we look at how Rupa Goswami in Nectar of Devotion and Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu defines Krishna, it's Akhila Rasamrita Murti, right? He who is the very embodiment, the fount of all rasa, of all relationship, to put it very generally. So if you have that relationality, then I think the heart of relationality, the heart of relationship, genuine relationship, is vulnerability. The two people in a relationship that is not merely a transactional or business relationship, that relationship is meaningful because they make one another vulnerable to each other's joys and sufferings. And that is something we find throughout the Bhagavata and throughout Gaudiya Vaishnava literature, of Krishna in all his avatars being affected directly by the pains and joys of his devotees. And that is even described by the Acharyas in their commentaries. Vishwanath Chakravarti actually is very beautifully, very fine in his ability to express Krishna's relational emotions in connection to his devotees. So I think that is one of the ways in which the Vaishnava tradition overcomes the distance between God's impassibility, God's lack of direct experience of human suffering and the human condition. That gap is bridged by his vulnerability in relationship.
And the second, you said there were two.
Yes, so the second is by the continuance, and there may be more. I don't mean to say these are the only two. These are the two I can think of at the moment. But the other, I think, in relation to this chapter, is the way that the theology of avatars continues beyond Vishnu Tattva, beyond the Leela avatars, beyond the great Vishnu avatars like Narasimha and Lord Ramachandra and others, into even empowered human beings, right? Shaktyavesha avatars. Persons like Narada and the four Kumaras and Lord Buddha, who are jivas, who are like us, except they are empowered by the Shakti of the power of the Lord is present within them for a particular reason. And that way you see that the string of avatars, the descent of avatars, fully reaches the human being, right? It doesn't stop. There's no gulf. That gulf is that chasm is overcome by the presence of those Shaktyavesha avatars, who are actually human, but are in touch with the divine realm in such a significant way, such a close way, that we can actually benefit and we can feel the Lord's presence through them, right? So in that way then, and they understand human suffering, actually do, because they experience it. They are human themselves, they're jivas.
Thank you. This was beautiful. And this also answers something that I've been thinking about. In this chapter, we have a list of 22 avatars, I think. And as you say, Gaudiya Vaishnava theology will do a lot with this list. In the verses of the Bhagavata here, they are not differentiated. It's just the first avatar, the second, the third. There are no words such as Yuga Avatar, Leela Avatar, Shaktyavesha Avatar. This is all later theological kind of systematization of what's being said here. And as a reader, when you read, for example, Prabhupada's purports, or you read Rupa Goswami's Lagu Bhagavatamrita, you might feel that they're taking liberties with the text. They are superimposing a system on it that is not there. But as you just explained it, we understand the idea, or some of the idea of it. There's other things going on as well. But but this shows clearly to us why they are doing that, and at least part of that. Nevertheless, there are many more questions that all of this gives rise to, and as you mentioned, there's this verse where Sutta says that these avatars are as innumerable as rivulets of water or something like that. And we hear about Avataras still today. We have Ammaji, the South Indian female guru who travels around the world. She comes to Finland every second year or so, and her followers call her an Avatara. Practically any of these big Hindu gurus today are all called Avataras by their followers. Prabhupada is not so liberal in using the term Avatara as this in his purports. But where do we draw the line? We do sometimes hear that people will say that their guru is some kind of avatara of a manjari or of a gopi or something like this. So how do we find kind of what is an avatara, a Shaktyavesha avatara? We'll hear that about Prabhupada, for example, that Prabhupada was a Shaktyavesha avatara of Nityananda's mercy or something like that. Where are the boundaries of all of this?
Yes, that's yet another tension that we find in the tradition, right? We spoke of transcendence and immanence as a tension that must always remain, right? It's not a tension we can get rid of. We wouldn't want to, because those two aspects of divinity are both essential. They must be held together. So I think what you are now very perceptively describing, Bhriguji, is yet another tension in relation to the theology of Avatara that I feel must be held carefully and preciously, like the others. And that's the tension of avatars being endless and innumerable, right? It is avatara hi asankhyeya is the first line of that verse. They are asankhya. There's no count to them. And that is important because we maintain the limitless capacity of the Lord, right? The Vaishnava tradition, I think, would be very disturbed by the idea of only one incarnation or only one avatar or one descent. No, if we are to speak of a God who has a body, then because bodies are limiting in our conception, we can compensate for that tangibility of a body by recognizing that the Lord has limitless bodies, right? So this is how Prabhupada elsewhere responds to the charge from impersonalists, for example, that giving God form limits him. He says, no, that form is unlimited in its power, and there are an innumerable number of forms. So the idea that God has a limitless number of avatars is crucial to maintaining the Lord's power and his achintya shakti, right? So that is crucial on the one hand. On the other hand, we want to maintain some kind of a distinction between human and God. Otherwise, the entire system collapses, right? Then there's no need for worship, no reason for bhakti, no worshipable Lord. So how do we maintain both? How do we keep the boundaries, and then we at the same time we allow for a unbounded Supreme Lord? And this is one of those things which is a paradox, and there's never a clean resolution. There's never a perfect resolution to it. It's a matter of how far we want to give in each direction, right? We can make God truly limitless and destroy all boundaries, but then there's costs associated with that. And we can keep very clear boundaries, but then there's costs associated with that as well. So I think you're right in that Srila Prabhupada was very keen on keeping those clear boundaries, because of I think, the historical moment that he preached in, that he taught in. I think it was very clear that there's a proliferation of claims to Avatara in the modern world, and of yogis and of various kinds of spiritualists. And that had been a struggle through the colonial period with Bhaktivinoda Thakur as well, something he faced, all until the present day. And I think Srila Prabhupada is emphasizing that boundedness of divinity, particularly in his purports in this chapter, by explaining that Shastra is crucial for the verification of Avatar, right? That the Bhagavata is our gold standard for Avatar. So there may be, whoever there may be, they have to be present there in the Srimad Bhagavatam for us to feel confident about their quality of being Avatar. At the same time, there is this wild card avatar category, which is the Shaktyavesha avatar, right? And this is the cowboy in the Wild West. It's difficult to contain the category of avatar of Shaktyavesha avatar, because now we're in the world of jivas. So it's not sacrilegious to call someone a Shaktyavesha avatar, because they're still jiva. All we are doing is acknowledging their empowerment by the Lord. So if there are claims to avatar outside of those described in the Bhagavata, then I think a more comfortable place for Gaudiya Vaishnavas is to say, yes, the Shaktyavesha avatar, these may be Shaktyavesha avatars. They may be jivas who are particularly empowered by the Lord to do wonderful things in this world and to uplift people. And I think that we have to keep very much open, because otherwise the possibility of divine intervention disappears, and it weakens considerably. So I think the best I can do is to acknowledge that tension and to recognize that Srila Prabhupada is very much on the side of boundedness, and to say, no, the avatars are those that are described in the Bhagavata, and beyond that, you're on your own. There is no guarantees of, we cannot certify authenticity beyond that. Within the Bhagavata, it's easy to certify authenticity.
Thank you. Let's get back to this, the verse here, which is also such key importance for many Vaishnavas, not just Gaudiya Vaishnavas, but followers of Vallabha and others, very much emphasize this 28th verse. Ete chang sakalapum saha Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam Indrari Vyakulam Lokam Hridayanti Yuge Yuge. That all of these are parts and parts of the Purusha, referring back to the whole list of the 22 avatars. But Krishna is Bhagavan Swayam, he's Bhagavan himself. Now, of course, for example, the whole Bhagavata Sandarbha of Jiva Goswami really builds on this half verse. It's not even the whole verse that they are interested in, but just the half verse. And critics of Jiva Goswami will say that there are many other places in the Bhagavata where the Bhagavata seems to say something else, that Krishna is an Amsha himself. Of course, he deals with those places himself in Krishna Sandarbha, for example. But do you think that there's danger here of lifting up half a verse into too much? Are the Gaudiya Vaishnavas actually, and these other Vaishnavas, are they actually reading the Bhagavatam as it is, to use Prabhupada's language, or do we have here an example of superimposing something on the text?
You're so good at asking hard questions.
Because I know you
very
have good
interesting
answers.
ones also. I so uh, this verse I think is crucial not just because of what it says, but where it is located. So just to further emphasize what you said, Jiva Goswami considers this to be one of the defining verses of the Bhagavata, right? This verse is the key to understanding the rest of the text. And this is a very conscious interpretive choice on his part. And in some ways, it's akin to Shankaracharya's notion of the Mahavakya, those few sentences, those few phrases that provide the interpretive key to the rest of the text. Whether we call them Mahavakyas or Paribhasha Sutras, there's a difference, of course, between them. And Alexander Uskokov has done nice work on this notion of Mahavakya as found within Gaudiya tradition as well as the Shankara tradition. So anyway, that's a little detailed, but for Jiva Goswami, this is a very crucial verse that provides an interpretive key to the whole of the Bhagavata. Now, I think it's clear to anyone that as an interpreter of a text, one has to make such choices, decisions to overlay a theology upon the text. That's the job of the commentator. It's one of the functions of a commentator. So I think that is quite natural for any commentator. We ought not be surprised that they would systematize a text within a particular theological system. That's why they do what they do. I think if we were to try to step back and look at the Bhagavata as a whole, or as the mula, the root text itself, without the overlay of commentary, to the extent that that is possible, right? There's always an interpretive lens on everything, but to the extent that we can take a step back, I think it is very clear that the Bhagavata offers a preeminent position to Krishna. Frida Matchett's book, Krishna, Lord or Avatar, I think she highlights in that this is one of the distinctive features of the Bhagavata as compared to, say, the Vishnu Purana or other Vaishnava texts, that the Bhagavata particularly provides a preeminent theological position to Krishna. So, in that sense, yes, it is as it is. This is the tenor of the Bhagavata, right? It's not just in the 10th book. I know we often highlight that, but right there in the first and second and third cantos, Krishna's life story, his relationships becomes the primary focus. He's entering Dwaraka, he's leaving earth, his avatar is ending, and the feelings of viraha, of separation of the Pandavas for Krishna. This is the stuff of the Bhagavata. This is what the Bhagavata feels overjoyed to describe. Right there in the first two cantos, that mood of separation is there. And then in the third canto, we meet Uddhava, who is crying buckets of tears in separation from Krishna and remembering all his leelas in that mood of separation, right? So Krishna is already, from the very beginning, he's highlighted, right? So the fact that the commentators highlight these first two, or this first half of Ete Cham Sakala Pumsa, that verse in this chapter, I think is more a reflection of the tenor of the Bhagavata than merely an imposition of some random verse selected. Because if you go to the story of the churning of the ocean, there are verses to Lord Shiva that are extremely laudatory, that describe him as the supreme, as the highest truth, right? So I suppose I could find a half verse there to highlight and elevate. But the problem with that elevation would be it doesn't match the tenor of the text as a whole. And so I think Ete Chamsa Kala Pumsa, the reason this verse becomes so crucial to the Gaudiya Vaishnava Acharyas and other Vaishnava Acharyas, as you've mentioned, the reason it becomes so crucial is because it actually it signals a quality of the text that is very apparent, and it signals it very early on. And now let me say just a couple words about the context of this verse. The meaning is significant. It says all these avatars we've described are either portions or portions of the portions of the Lord, but Krishna is Bhagavan Swayam. And this word Swayam, endlessly our acharyas describe this importance of Swayam, right? That he is that Supreme Lord. But the location of that verse is particularly significant because it comes at the end of a long list of avatars in which Krishna has already been mentioned. And I think that's the crucial thing here, is that there's an acknowledgement that Krishna is also descending like everyone else, and he's doing the same functions as other avatars are. But then the fact that Sutta Goswami then returns and pulls one of those avatars out to say that one is different, right? It's that contextual location that I think adds further weight to the claim that this verse is a key indicator of the Bhagavata's overall theology.
Yeah, I like that very much. And of course, you mentioned the 10th canto, and that's also a quite evident mark. I mean, it's you could think that it's one canto out of 12, but it's nearly half of the whole text. It's so huge.
Yes.
So it really, I mean, it very much is the center of the whole text in that sense. I have another verse here in this chapter which belongs to my favorites, and maybe you have others as well. That one is towards the end of the chapter, verse 43, and this is part of Sutta's reply to the final question. Where has Dharma taken shelter now when we're living in the age of Kali? And I mean, this is very, very important for the sages there in Naimisharanya. It's beautifully described how they're engaged in this sacrifice, this 1,000-year sacrifice that was mentioned in the beginning, in the first chapter, and they're going to get back to that later. And they've probably been doing it for some time already. They've heard all the other Puranas, they've heard the Mahabharata. So many things have been going on, and they're doing this sacrifice for counteracting the effects of the age of Kali. It's kind of tragic heroism in a sense, because they're engaged in something great. They're trying to keep whatever is good in the world and block out bad influences. But at the same time, I'm sure they're realizing this is something that can't be done. You can't turn back time. You can't hinder time. But nevertheless, they're trying their best. And Krishna has left the world. And with Krishna, it's like darkness has descended on the world. And they're living in that time. They're living in that time when they're noticing that things are quickly getting worse. So they are asking then Sutta, where will we find divinity in this dark world? And that's the last of their 6 questions. And Sutta then gives several verses as an answer, but I wanted to pick out this one, 43. Krishne swadhamo pagate dharma jnana adibhi saha kalaunash tadrishamesha puranarko dhunurita. And Prabhupada translates it as this. This Bhagavata Purana is as brilliant as the sun, and it has arisen just after the departure of Lord Krishna to his own abode, accompanied by religion, knowledge, and so on. Persons who have lost their vision due to the dense darkness of ignorance in the age of Kali shall get light from this Purana. So the Bhagavata here speaks about itself as a sun that has arisen in this dark age. And I like this metaphor very much because we're speaking here about, at the very beginning of the Bhagavatam, about the rising sun. It's not yet kind of completely arisen. But when we kind of follow the text through the cantos, we're going to see how the sun is coming up, and then in the 10th canto, we're going to get kind of the full light. Do you have any thoughts about this verse, or about the way the Bhagavata presents itself in this way as giving light in the age of Kali?
First of all, this is one of my favorites in this chapter as well, so I'm glad you brought it up. I have 3 favorite verses in this chapter. The first is the Ete Cham Sakalapumsa Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam. And then the second was this one. And then the third, perhaps we'll have time to speak about it. But here with this verse in particular, I think, in reading a vast work like Bhagavata, Purana, I think we have to remember that context is so much. Context is so important to the reading of a text like this, and for good reason. I think we extract a small number of verses and memorize them and speak of them and treasure them. Because especially with a work that is thousands of verses long, how else will you hold on to it except by selecting your favorites? So, of course, that is a good thing. At the same time, sometimes in that remembering process, we, or at least I, forget the larger context in which a particular verse appears. And this verse is significant because it's establishing the position of the Bhagavata at the very beginning, in response to this query from the sages, which you have so nicely described just now, right? That its context in the narrative of the sages who are struggling after this 1,000-year yajna and worried about the future and what it will hold. That context, I think, is so important, which you have described. And the only thing I can add is perhaps the other context, which is the context within this chapter itself, which is we have just received a list of avatars, all of which are in the past, and one of which is in the distant future. So for the reader, I think the question then arises is, where is the Lord's presence to be found now, today, in my life, in my world, in this terrible age of Kali? Where can I find the Lord's presence? And I think it is no coincidence that the Bhagavatam juxtaposes the list of avatars with the Bhagavatam itself, being described as Brahma Sammitam. This is Brahman itself. This is the form of the Lord. Krishna is gone, but he is present here in the form of his, of this, is, as Prabhupada, I think, very beautifully describes it, calls it the literary incarnation of the Lord, right? So this is avatar in book form for this age. And I think that makes it very powerful, because we've seen 22 avatars. We have highlighted Krishna as the source of all avatars. And then we are left with this empty feeling, going, okay, so what about me? Where am I now? Because Krishna Swadhamo Pagate, Krishna's gone. He went to his abode. So me, what about me? And the Bhagavatam says, don't worry, I'm here for you, right? This book is Krishna's presence. And of course, from this, we get the beautiful division of the cantos of Srimad Bhagavatam in the form of the Lord's body, right? So his lotus feet are the Pada Padma. The Pada Padma are the first 2 cantos of Srimad Bhagavatam, and then we move up to his knees and his waist, and then finally the 10th canto is his beautiful face, and the Rasa Lila chapters are his smile. So the Acharyas say, okay, if this is Krishna, then we must see Krishna in the pages. His body is present. This is the body of the Lord for the people of this age.
And I think you just revealed the third verse, your third favorite verse. That was number 40, wasn't it?
Let's see, 40. Well, no. I see 40. I see 40 as basically making the same point as 43.
Okay.
as the one you
picked it
highlighted.
up based on what you said about Puranam Brahma Samhitam.
Yes, yes. But I have yet one more favorite. I have too
Okay,
many favorites. Shall I tell you what it is?
please.
Okay, so it's the final verse of this chapter. And the final verse, I'll read it here. It says, it's actually 1.5 verses. Tatra kirtayato vipra viprarsher bhuri tejasa aham chadhyagamam tatra nivishtas tad anugrahat soham va shravayashyami yathadhitam yathamati. And I'll read Srila Prabhupada's translation. He says, O learned Brahmanas, when Shukadev Goswami recited Bhagavatam there in the presence of Emperor Parikshit, I heard him with rapt attention, and thus by his mercy I learned the Bhagavatam from that great and powerful sage. Now I shall try to make you hear the very same thing as I learned it from him and as I have realized it. I think this verse is such an important hermeneutical key to understanding scripture. Yatha dhitam, yatha mati, right? So adhitam is as I have learned it. So that's the first principle of learning, of Vaishnav teaching, of understanding, right? Yasya deve para bhaktir yatha deve tatha guru. If we have to be presenting things as it is, we have to present things in the way that we have received it. We have to be good learners, good listeners. Shrava yishyami, right? That verse Shravana is here in this verse. So that's so important to the picture of understanding scripture, of learning. But it's only half the picture. There's yatha dhitam, as I have learned it, and then yatha mati, that is as I have realized or understood it. And that piece says, okay, you have learned it, you have been faithful, you have been you have fidelity towards tradition, but it is also your responsibility to make it your own, to understand it in your life, in your context, and for as it is relevant for your time. And we see that in the context of this verse, right? Sutta Goswami is saying, I've been a good student, I've listened carefully, I will tell you what I heard. At the same time, his context is different, right? He's speaking for Kali Yuga explicitly. He's not going to die in 7 days. Rather, he is faced with an endless period of time, something that seems endless, right? 432,000 years yet to go, and the world is going to degrade. How do I manage it, right? So now he's saying yatha mati. I'm going to explain it for as I have realized it for my time, for my audience, for the issues that face me. And this is what I like to say is theology made relevant, right? It has to be, this session has been all about tensions that we hold together, creative tensions, paradoxes. So this is, I would say, the final tension in the chapter. It's the very last words. The tension between being faithful, being a postman, delivering things as it is, yathaditam, but at the same time ensuring that what we are presenting is relevant, it's understandable, it's practical, it's realized that I have made it my own. That's yathamati. And he puts the two things right head to head in this verse and says, I'm going to do both, right? And this whole Bhagavatam is going to live within that paradox.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I began this episode by saying that whenever I meet you, I get to be uplifted and inspired, and I think you just personified this last statement, yathaditam yathamati. So thank you very much for this, Radhika Raman Prabhu. I was thinking that I would discuss more with you, but I ended up listening to you, and it's always like that. I feel I learned so many different things. Thank you very much, and I hope you'll appear again on this podcast in the future.
I would love to, Bhrigu Prabhu. I always enjoy my conversations with you so much. When we meet online like this, but also when we've met in person. So thank you. Thank you for being who you are, and for providing this opportunity for us to reflect on the Bhagavata in a very devotional and scholarly way put together. This is a beautiful combination, and so I hope I will have the opportunity to speak with you again in this forum. Thank you.